Shinji and Warhammer40k, Chapter 37, All Along the Watchtower, Part 3. Did you see that Death Stranding trailer? Boy, that was good. Wow, this really dates the recording, huh? The Chimera was a much more sensible design compared to its larger sibling, but also shared many of its disadvantages. The large wraparound tracks increased its profile and required greater effective torque from the engine. They had fixed steel armour, which meant it weighed towards MBT scales just for an APC. However, as proven in those days around the centre of Europe, there are also great advantages to size, in carrying capacity and being able to go wherever. The miasma had spread to cover most of the country. People fled on whatever they could find: trucks, bikes, cows. There were still those who dared to venture inside the dense dark fog to pick up stragglers. Wilfred staggered out of the miasma and was nearly shot, run over, and burned. Only the timely intervention of their attached psyker saved the shambling, benumbed young man. In truth, the psyker was as much a conscript as the soldiers with him. He had little particular loyalty to the UN, and even less desire for Nagisa's terrifying visions, but he was uprooted from his comfortable dentistry practice. And for what? To serve as some sort of human divining rod? They'd taken his good reputation, his family, almost everything he'd worked for through the years. It was a vast injustice, and how he raged. His family's safety rested upon his cooperation. They were at Tokyo 3. Nagisa and the Cradle, for all their bluster, it would take much more to actually crack the city fortress. His family was safe there. Only his actions preserved their continued well-being. The suspicion, the disdain, he endured it all. The Psychana hastily formed out of pressured assets such as him. It was betrayed from within. Grumbling, the soldiers obeyed his order to take the man in. Sure, the UN Psychana, for all its grandiose claims and multiple near violations of human rights, had failed to secure international command. But it was those same minds that protected them now, even within the miasma. Those minds allowed distant communications, even when the finest electronics failed. It was a new and painful and bewildering lesson to the world that stealth was useless, even as absolute stealth proved to be possible. Anything within an AT field may as well be in another universe, where nothing could be trusted to be what they seemed. The problem lay in that it was a field, and like through any medium, there would be disturbances and distortions from anything passing through. Only a stupidly huge machine like an Ava could hide within it, or small pockets of men and machinery, shielded from notice from the very antithesis of the AT field, the psychic emanations from certain souls. The bones of Wilfred's wrist showed right on his skin, so deathly tight was his grip on the bolt pistol. In the end, they let him keep it. It was empty anyway. He kept staring at its grinning skull. He felt numb, and his memory kept flashing through the same events again and again until the pain fed upon itself. The screams through the comm channels, only to be cut short with gurgles or booms. The feeling of panic, held back only by the knowledge that his crew depended upon his finding a route into safety. The voice inside his skull, telling him to stop. With his brother's voice, almost he believed it. The shelter they were supposed to protect, it was overrun. Or did he run it over? He couldn't remember anymore. The crunch of things under his treads, he didn't care. Only one thing remained in his mind. To stop was to die. To keep going was life. That thing, which ripped their panzer open as if its armour was paper, so beautiful and its promises so luscious. His hand and the bolt pistol began to shake, glowing in the dark with eyes red as sunset, lips red as roses, teeth sharp as knives. The Chimera was roomy, and more injured soldiers were belted onto the side benches. None of them dared to meet any other's eyes. Good tank, the young soldier mumbled hoarsely as it rumbled back to its task. Brother would have liked it. His palm felt the memory of the pistol's discharge, the hot flash of a bolt into an open turret ring, screaming, fleeing into the dark. The pack that chased him between the shadows. He remembered, calling out for help. Did someone answer? The experience had left him dead in ways even their taint couldn't touch. He wanted to scream and shout and spill blood, but nothing. His body refused to obey. He could only live in presence of the enemy. The air itself grew heavy, laden with electric charge. The miasma started to lift like an unfolding umbrella. Sunlight spread out from its edges. It showed shriveled trees and bare rock, lumpy remains of what had once been war machinery, hollow structures and the cast-off cloths of missing corpses. Nothing remained that was once living. all biomass consumed to appease the hunger of a bestial god. Thunder rolled. The miasma flashed bright green as it dispersed the coherent energies of strike from beyond the heavens. The cradle shook as its shell flaked away. "The spore cloud managed to reduce the damage by almost 70%, was the report from the cradle's own command center. "An AT field thrust! It could have destroyed us in one hit if it didn't bring sufficient density and psychic energy to blunt the effects," Dr. Lader hissed. "Now we know the moon cradle is also fully operational. The old man sacrificed the Red Earth ceremony just for this temporal power!" Nagisa scoffed. "They see me as an affront to their whole belief system, while nerve remains the greater threat. The fools, the suicidal idiots! Sawyer will be here in a few hours. I don't need this useless aggravation." "The super laser is charged," Dr. Lader added. "Return fire." A similar green beam lanced out from the cradle's matte black husk. The luminescent walls inside the Earth's Cradle dimmed momentarily. "And now they know we are not defenseless." "We cannot sustain this with just one angel core, Nagisa," the cybernetic scientist warned. He was referring to the core removed and implanted into Nagisa's new Warborn, and the other core providing power to the two other tridents. With 3 angel cores, the Earth's Cradle managed to skirmish with a half-awakened moon cradle. "This demonstration is enough. They can't risk destroying Lilith's physical form at Tokyo 3. There, as here, only a direct assault has any chance of success. And with Soyuz successfully driven to Europe, that deprived Nerve of the power of a fully realized S2 engine. Out in the wastelands, the shockwave of those 2 blasts had tipped a Chimera to its side. Its passengers piled out, coughing at all the dust still whirling about. Wilfred stared out at the scene of such casual malice. He looked down at his bolt pistol and then to the northwest, which had prevented his brother from becoming an abomination. Meaningless. Against such power they were all already dead men. The cradle was rubbing their face in it, and showing that the only way to avoid the fate of small and fragile beings was to share the life of something greater. The young soldier spat aside. They'd taken everything from him. His girlfriend and his foster family, their shelter was already probably overrun. The aliens had robbed him of his innocent world. The mutants had taken from him his own hopes for a future without war. The Psyker was wounded and unconscious. "We can't stop here," Wilfred told the others there. His bleak tone of voice sufficed, even without the attaché to translate. "This is unclean country. Pick up a weapon and let's go." Europe was considered all but a lost cause without the Evangelions. The President was understandably reluctant to let their Ava leave, were it not for the legal issue that it was not their Evangelion in the first place. Their radar posts screamed. Really, there was no better word to describe it. Blue pattern detectors were ringing all over the world. The Nerve American branch in Boston was built like the Nerve Germany branch. Though fortified to a respectable degree, they knew full well they wouldn't survive an all-out angel attack. World communications were still patchy, and Nerve Japan had gone black less than 2 hours ago. Anything could have happened. Whatever it was, it came from the east. It was big. Fighters were scrambled to intercept, but found that they couldn't get a good enough look. The best they could do was Mach 2.8. The thing was blowing through the skies at about 6 to 8 times the speed of sound. The scream of supersonic flight was familiar, but those on the ground could have sworn it sounded like, "Oh, shit!" The flying supercarrier overshot the base and was lost to the horizon. Maniacal laughter was coming from the comms of one of the fighter pilots escorting the thing. "It's not possible!" His voice cracked with frantic disbelief. "It can't fly, it can't! It's not right!" Minutes passed. 10. Then 30. At close to an hour, Castle Sturmbrand slid back into view. Regular puffs of its rocket engines kept it going, its shadow passing over the Boston base. Even that felt heavy. Unlike the first 2 Nerve installations in Tokyo 3 and Berlin 2, the Nerve branch's staging area was at the outskirts of the city. Most in Boston had already evacuated well ahead of time anyway. Just the sight of it was maddening. Even the greatest of the old Zeppelins were put to shame. At a little more than 300 metres long, Castle Sturmbrand was taller than the Eiffel Tower and possessed more volume than the Great Pyramid. The rockets twisted downwards and fired to control its descent. White smoke filled the area. There was only the deep crunching sound as the great craft rested upon its landing pylons. It was the first of its kind, and yet the ultimate of another. The new and terrible Zeppelin, pun implied. Some were already calling it the Neo Teppelin. The cargo doors opened with a sharp hiss. By the expression of Soryu's face, she wasn't willing to comment. "What are you waiting for?" she shouted. "Move it! We've got a war to win!" Mayumi Yamagishi was a slim, glasses-wearing girl, 15 years old, but a little tall for her age. Her long, nearly waist-length hair gave her an air of maturity that made her shyness seem like aloofness. The staff were uniformly protective of her, but there was no one she really could consider as a friend. Even her own classmates, for following Tokyo 3's example, pilots were to be allowed a normal growing experience as far as possible, didn't try to get in too close to the gloomy girl. There was some comfort in being alone, she thought. She was free of others' demands, or to pretend to be something she wasn't. Mayumi knew well enough she was a shadow. She was an Ava pilot, but Tokyo 3 and its own Evangelions were the centrepiece. She didn't feel inferior, inasmuch as simply redundant. She was content with being what she was, but often wondered or wished for the sort of fiery confidence her peers possessed. She was giddy with excitement, but it only showed in increased clumsiness and deeper silence. Inside her skull she was screaming with joy, but those on the base saw only a stoic readiness. They wondered if she was preparing to measure herself against Soryu, reputedly the most competitive and egotistical of the pilots. Logically, she knew she had no chance. Her experience was all simulation, battles created through Soryu's own obsessive input into the best sort of training. Emotionally, Mayumi would be honoured to personally feel defeat at the other pilot's hands. Ikari scared her a little for some reason. Sure, she could see his attractive points, but he just lacked that feeling. Maybe he was too dark, too coldly competent somehow. Ayanami was similarly threatening to her self-image. She, who liked silence, knew well how much judgment lay behind a flat gaze. They didn't burn, not like Soryu. They were too much like her. They wouldn't be able to pull her out and make her brighter than what she was. Unlike Tokyo 3, or the Cradle, or Berlin 2 for that matter, Nerve Boston didn't have a genius scientist to serve as a showpiece. Sure, they had many prominent names, but no all-encompassing mind like a Kagi or Leda, and even the most of their best thinkers died at the Unit 4 Nevada test. The closest they had was Donald Thompson, PhD. At 26, he was still closer to a prodigy than a full-on genius, but he bore responsibility for Unit 3's functions. The young scientist stood only a little taller than the pilot, which combined with his scrawny body and scraggly corn-yellow hair didn't give much for his self-confidence. He had an earnest but confused look, which wasn't so unusual upon the faces of scientists in those times. Incidentally, under the online nickname of Yamu, he had beaten Kensuke Ada in the quarter-finals, and lost soon thereafter. There was a difference between knowing the actual strategic potential of new and ever more destructive technologies, and the proper application for their fantasy equivalents. He was also the closest Mayumi could consider as a friend on the base, inasmuch as two terminal introverts could really relate to each other. They stood there near the landing gantries, watching Unit 3 being loaded, utterly unwilling to break the silence with banal conversation. For all the production miracles Inhis could pull, it still remained that their efforts would pale beside the industrial juggernaut that was the American military-industrial complex in full swing. Unit 3 had its own Titan modules, with its own weapon systems and various support vehicles. Even with more limited access to superconducting material, Unit 3 had a stronger internal battery than most other Evangelions. It helped that it was a solid design, building upon the difficulties met with the proto, test, and production model. The torso and power systems were indistinguishable from that of Unit 2. The major change lay with the arms. It was a new super tensile material that only recently proved to be eerily similar to Wraith bone. It was mutable in the same manner, conducted electricity in much the same way. The only serious difference was that it was apparently activated by the AT field, not psychic energy. Just why was it that the AT field generated by angels and the psychic emanations from certain humans so opposing to the point of cancelling each other out, when they seemed to share certain effects? Was one meant to imitate the other? Was it all just a coincidence that the Evangelions in their natural form were like human giants? The lure of forbidden knowledge was also used to draw minds into the cradle. Dr. Thompson forced his thoughts away from that line of inquiry. It was bad enough trying to deal with the escalating levels of weapon lethality, as proof that insane thing shadowing the whole base. But those were terrible questions, with terrible answers. He was young, and therefore disposable. Someone had to go with Yamagishi off to near certain death, and they had assumed he had all the willful enthusiasm of youth when it comes to such dangers. The Teplin Castle Sturmbrand was huge, and already loading up an entirely volunteer company of American troops. The customary approach to overseas operations were futile. There was no AA or radar locations to take out ahead of time. GPS was worthless, and stealth of utterly no value. Only through the protection of the great craft could any force actually hope to force a landing. They would be the biggest target in the sky, true enough, but it was better than being cut to pieces on the ground. Marines were ready to meet Marines. As they boarded, Thompson wondered if it was deliberate. Every group of soldiers was of course all too willing to show off, but even past impact, maybe they had prided themselves for too long about being the best of the best. Introductions were done. The Terminator's Legio's harsh electronic voice did not intimidate much. They evoked more of curiosity. Though parts were gathered from all over the world, only in Boston were they finally assembled, just a stone's throw from the nerve branch build over the former MIT labs, and no one had noticed. In retrospect, there might have been some psychic meddling going on there, but it was still the equivalent of, say, Brazil beating the Americans and Russians to the moon using off-the-shelf parts to build their rocket. Armour strong enough to take tank rounds to the face. Indeed, the brutes the Cradle deployed were attempts to mimic the success of the tactical dreadnought armour. Only infantry may ever really hold ground, and no infantry could break or hold ground like the Heraclitus. Utterly useless for the purpose of the Marines, for the shock value of the armour was softened by penalties in weight and movement. The Psychana, with their lighter powered framed, but silvered instead of golden, radiated amusement, as if guessing at their thoughts. Now that was enough to discomfort them. "Major Richard Torildo and Company," saluted one of the soldiers ahead of the 4 APCs. Chimeras fitted with dual bolter turrets and a third mounted up front next to the driver. Technicians outside were already installing additional CIWs and las cannon mounts. "Permission to come aboard, sir." "Captain Walter Shade, formerly of the USS Milwaukee, then the UNS Kringlith. Welcome to our Castle Sturmbrand, Major." At the questioning look, he continued. "This thing was shaped by one girl's will, and kept aloft only by her willingness to spit at the very logic of the universe. We're supposed to obey the UN, but never forget, we live only as long as we serve the purpose of one little lost girl's vengeance." "I see." The Major turned to another soldier that approached. "I am Major Kondraty Ustinov. Will you have problems with being under our direct command for the duration?" he was asked. "Not at all, sir. We are ready." Donald Thompson couldn't help but laugh. American troops under the command of a Russian, while inside the German Teplin built in Japan, off to fight heretics from the mountains of Kenya. Meanwhile, Greek mercenaries and displaced Tibetans meddled in things no one else understood. A strange era that he was so lucky to live in. Soon enough, it was time to leave again.
"Alright, listen up. This is my castle. When I order something, I don't care how crazy it sounds. You don't ask questions, you obey. The only reason this crazy thing flies is because I want it to. The only reason you're here is to destroy the enemy. Any questions?"
"No, ma'am, we understand." The Unit 3 contingent shook their heads, with Mayumi far more enthusiasm than necessary. She clutched at her head, dizzy.
"Good. The first one to make a crack about this castle and Graf Zeppelin, I'll throw you out myself. Do you understand me?"
"Ma'am! Yes, ma'am!"
"Bitte,"
she finished with an overdramatic throw of hands.
"Now I just have to find the wise guy playing Ride of the Valkyries over the speakers and beat his ass into the deck plating."
Her look softened.
"So, we meet at last, Yamagishi?"
"Yes." The girl was unsure of bowing or offering a handshake. Asuka laughed at her. She grabbed at the other girl's hands and dragged her away. She couldn't see the long-haired pilot's blush at the contact.
"Come on! Your over's bolted in, and my own's still feeding excess power to the capacitors. It's time to teach you to fly!"
How could it be so simple and yet so difficult? There was joy there and even peace. But was the reason she failed so often to feel the touch of Soyu's burning soul overwhelm her own?
"No!"
Asuka shouted through the link.
"No fear! No hesitation! We soar on rings of fire, and the winds feed our fervour. What's the ground, huh? Just rock. Stupid, unmoving rock. Only we are free, and if we say we will not fall, then we won't!"
Donald Thompson, PhD, was banging his head against the metal walls of the control centre. "You get used to it eventually," one of the technicians said while giving him a sympathetic pat to the shoulders.
This isn't about power. It's not like the Angels don't possess their own versions of the S2 engine, and we still manage to kick their asses. We cheat like hell, we hit them where it hurts, and we win, because we're brutal creatures like nature intended.
Is there something to be proud of? Mayumi dared to ask.
Of course! Who else would be who we are? We can only be ourselves, no matter what. And right here, right now, we own the sky!
Mayumi eeped as she felt the burst of power expand outwards. So bright. Castle Sturmbrand tipped back up to the sky, playing merry hell with everyone's sense of balance. From the outside, the Zeppelin was a speck at the tip of a broad conical white wall, even so high up in the atmospheric border, where the air was thin. Still, the AT field was all that was keeping the hull from glowing red hot. From that height, it would take whole minutes for even the great craft, with all the aerodynamic properties of a flying brick, to actually fall. It would still be a few hours till they crossed the Atlantic, so it was the perfect time for a crash course in wingless flight. Those inside were already, literally, getting sick of it. Finally, the captain voiced his concerns. Miss Soyu, we already established that Miss Yamagishi can maintain the field long enough for us to try and glide to a stop.
No, she has to know how to get this thing flying again, and we're not going back. Otherwise, the only way we're going to stop is by ramming this thing into the goddamn cradle so I can kill everything inside. You know how I earned this S2 engine? Power's not enough. Skill's not enough. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Not really, the captain said with a sigh. So you can be such a bitch sometimes, but most often there is a deeper reason for that insistence.
If we don't go all out, we die,
she added somewhat wistfully.
It's as simple as that. We've got a war to win, and once again it's the enemy that has all the aces. It's...
See you, Mayumi gasped.
Good, you're keeping your AT field meshed with mine. I felt that too. Captain, incoming!
As they figured out before, barrier AT fields were generally created relative to the generating Evangelion. The problem rises when said Ava is travelling at approaching or over the speed of sound. There are two ways of handling the fence in such a state. With the presence of a second AT field from another Evangelion, a softer AT field could try to disperse the attack. This worked best against the energy beams. Kinetic strikes would just go through, for it wasn't a barrier per se. Mayumi Yamagishi in Unit 3 extended her AT field out to 5 kilometres, for this leeching power from the trailing edge of Unit 2's own AT field.
It's not working,
she barely had time to say. Battle screens! The captain shouted. Fortunately, the order had already been preempted by the officer at the controls. The passive deflection systems had already ramped up to full. Castle Sturmbrand shook as a kiss of plasma blackened the paint of its hull. A second strike did no more damage. It worked, he breathed out. When something moving hyperkinetic met another thing also going hyperkinetic, usually both explosively vaporize. Large as the castle may be, the damage would still be catastrophic. Slugs at that speed could even break through Evangelion-class armour. Below at the Ava controls, Dr. Thompson nodded with similar feelings of awe and relief. The intensely strong electromagnetic field formed plasma that performed like some sort of anti-kinetic battle screen. It wasn't the total barrier of the AT field, but for something completely man-made. It was close. Matter is stripped into its constituent atoms. The faster it goes, the more assured its destruction. It was also useful against particle beams, positron beams, and to a middling extent, lasers. The problem was the plasma bloom from the other side of the screen, and that it was a hideously power-hungry defence. Even the massive capacitors of the castle took appreciable drain. The limitless power of the S2 engine can only output at a certain rate. But it worked. Distressingly, it also showed the Cradle was aware of their approach and their location. A preemptive strike against Tokyo 3 wouldn't have worked anyway, since the distance was enough to allow for detection sites and the power of 3 Ava's AT field. Something over the Atlantic, though. The range was short enough for a more rapid, reliable response. Nagisa had shortened his reach.
Karu's ready to kill me,
Asuka realised. She grinned.
Good. He respects me that much at least.
Having taken control over most of Europe, the Cradle had access to their arsenal. The next ones were nukes. Refugees were pouring over distant borders, but there were those who simply couldn't run anymore. Many more millions had already decided to throw themselves at the mercy of the Cradle. Buildings were collapsed across streets in crude fortifications, and all that remained of the military of 3 nations dug in. The region was Thuringen, the place Gotha. It was like going from midnight to noon. A gaping circle above the city showed serene blue sky, and the cradle's stifling purple miasma couldn't trespass on that dominion. At the centre of their own protected domain was an old church, St. Margaret's. Inside, an old blind woman prayed. Outside was a baying mob. "You brought this upon us!" they were shouting. "Turn it off! Let us leave!" Lama Feckeldraft was, quite frankly, amazed. It was beyond even his abilities. The power of simple faith by an old woman. Where'd it come from? Her own will, or someplace else? The brutes were powerful but slow. Their shields could take hits from battle tanks, their arm cannons could destroy the tanks, but they were slow. Force blades could cut them through, and blessed bolts punched through AT field-shaped armour. The cost was bitter, but a mere 60 men convinced the Cradle that massed heavy infantry wasn't the way to get through. The 5 silver-armoured guards with him were all that remained of the best of 3 generations. Not since having to flee to Germany. Not since 75 years did he feel so old and weak and useless. Wards, psychic imprints, localised perturbations in space-time, whatever esoteric terms they may be called, the protections wouldn't hold for much longer. The battle, as we well knew, raged on multiple levels and across time. There was the quite mundane war spreading across Europe, with proud armies being crushed one after the other by unnatural forces. And another, in the hurry to upset the plans of other powers. Then the ever-present battle in the hearts of humanity. She may have been beautiful once, and though her face was lined with age, there was a certain youthful quality to it. Her white hair hung over her eyes, which were but flesh-coloured bumps. Birth hadn't given her eyeballs. She'd never needed them. Brasidas seized the mouse, and being bit by it, let it go. Sauceless whispers wafted through the church. There is nothing so contemptible, said he, that which may be safe if it had courage to defend itself. Bellarmine allowed the fleas and other odious vermin to prey upon him. We shall have heaven, he said, to reward us for our sufferings. But these poor creatures have nothing but the enjoyment of the present life. Such difference is there between the maxims of a Greek hero and a Catholic saint. The bait was left untouched. She allowed herself a small smile. A man, an old man especially, would have seized that as opening for debate or tirade, finding more joy in the struggle than fulfilment of the purpose. Such a difference there was between intelligence and wisdom. Apparently the child was not used to being ignored. Such spoiled children often were, by their own powers or those stolen from others, sought to keep attention all to themselves. I don't understand it really, this blind faith. How can you live with it? After everything that happened. Don't you get it? You're just talking to yourself. How much more must I defile this world for that God to appear? If there is a heaven, let it show itself. If there is a plan, then let it be done. The voice echoed with 1,000 voices. Let him appear. Let him stop me, if he even can. Sister Luminitsa shook her head sadly. It was clear enough the boy meant it, that blasphemy, that isolation, the deep and lingering frustration. Angry young men, so much in a hurry to change the world. All through time, each of them thought their pain was unique, that destroying the old was necessary to give birth to the new. Justice to be made through pain and blood, washing away old sins by even newer atrocities. They had earnest faces and pure souls, those eyes sad even in triumph, so much like young Vlad. How much trouble they had with young Vlad. It was all the same, daring death yet longing for it, denying faith but full of hunger for meaning. This sentiment must have carried through, for she felt that burning power batter even more at the edges of her consciousness. The dark skin of the Rom can be traced all the way back to India, but the souls that rejoice in secrets. Why is the root of the name Gypsy from a gypsy? Mere coincidence? Historical error? You do not believe in coincidences. Your sister tried to hide, but now she's part of the glorious gathering of souls. She's gone from the true Book of the Dead. Would you like to hear her? You live now, only because you abandoned her, abandoned all your people, even as they were marched off into the camps. They suffered, and they died. And you are here. Do you think what you're doing is enough to earn forgiveness? Sister Luminitsa bit her lip. The sight made her almost impossible to entrap. Even as she tried, she could only see one true path at once. Many, many more people died even as she tried. She could only be in one place at a time. But worse yet, perhaps, was that she couldn't judge the enemy as they may have deserved. She never seen any man's face, but saw in the light of their souls how so few were really so irredeemably evil. She had plenty of reasons to hate, but found it difficult to keep that in her heart. To treat the loss so calmly. It was as if what was lost didn't really have much value. She could see, but couldn't say what justice should be. Only God can make sense of the ever-present contradictions and repeating mistakes of humanity's history. Only one person dares to try and stop me, but the irony. You know that by all words of prophecy, you support that which will kill the very heart of your faith. We are revealed only by the greatest atrocity possible. Death and suffering on such a scale unimaginable. He will fight even that so many should pay for so few, that the self-important arrogance of some old men should condemn the world into greater misery. The greater good denies any justice in that. I refuse to entertain any deity so narrow-minded, so selfish, so blatantly malevolent. I refuse even the half of me that aches to rejoin the source. I will bring mankind to the heaven that they deserve, that they built, and the rest of the men not killed by these plagues, yet repented, not of the works of their hands, that they should not worship devils and idols of gold, of silver and brass and stone and of wood, which neither can see nor hear nor walk. I see, I hear, but a silence that greets me. The roads I build for humanity will be walked. You won't stop me, you weak old hag! You are broken, useless, unnecessary. These are the times when God's awake, but not yours. Not any more. The slightest doubt, the slightest crack in the dam. That was all he needed. She was blind, yet in her other sight she felt as if she might go blind again. So much power! How could one mortal hope to keep it at bay? The beast raged in the distance, otherworldly power twisting the very forces of nature around itself. She remembered another angry young man, so enraged and so willing to burn himself and everything, helpless in the tide of history. There were the Kabbalistic formulas, but these were more of tools than principles for combat and destruction. He wanted to break open the world, but even as his people had suffered, as too many people suffered under the costs of war, he was made to realise that adding more suffering into the world would solve nothing. Exposing the secret would give no one any comfort. So he fled all the way to the east, where the ancient traditions still stand guard. She remained to watch over the land still in pain. So many orphans, so full of pain and hate. How could they have known, back then in 1948, that an even greater atrocity was approaching? And now they both fought to preserve a crippled but freshly innocent Germany. Such was life. "Merciful Saviour, please," she whispered. "Let no more children go astray." Morning brought warmth, but not much relief. They were in an island in a dark and purple sea. The mood was ugly. Not even 24 hours had passed, but already the people were at the breaking point. Nearly 5 million crammed into a city meant to hold at best 60,000 residents. There was no power, no water, and only the military's presence kept the limited food stocks from igniting riots. Yang was right. Telepathy was an attack against which there was practically no defence. The Psychana could keep the miasma at bay, but not the more subtle intrusions into people's dreams and emotions. Not that they needed much more prodding to get nightmares that would last them the rest of their lives. As always, when it comes to the cradle, there was some basic logic underneath. Unconditional surrender simply meant they'd be allowed to flee over the border. Germany, and portions of all surrounding nations, would be the new cradle of humanity. A sovereign land. A place where dreams and fantasy may come true. It was useless to resist. Heroism is proportional to the challenges overcome. Nagisa saw this as a sort of moral evolution. Large shapes with leathery wings circled at the edges of the city, buoyed by the interaction between resonant AT fields. Dragons. Feckeldraft frowned. He was quite sure that was meant as an insult, to make the impossible possible. That was also a miracle. Gotha, a major rail centre, became a city of more importance as the North and Baltic Seas swelled beyond reason. The miasma-choked highways were fatal accidents waiting to happen. Railways had direct, predictable paths and the capacity to move mass amounts of people quickly. The problem was that once those rails were cut, those millions were quite effectively stuck. Only those guarded by psychers, centering upon the emanations from Gotha, could hope to navigate through the gloom. The added problem there was that the people were just as likely to lynch them as to be guided by them. That, and there were hardly enough trucks for 5 million people. They were gathered in and around Schloss Friedenstein, the ancient fortifications quite useless to their plight. Directly to the south and across a small lake were the railways, now ruined slag. The flat expanse was turned into a mini dead man's land, laced with trenches, barbed wire and gun emplacements. Tanks waited hull down over the rise. The helpless populace were less than a stone's throw away from that first and final line of defence. Unconditional surrender was the only option. It was the only way they could be allowed to walk out of there. "If we don't surrender, we will die," Mayor Stark Matstein shouted. "The more we resist, the more calamity they're just going to heap on us." He was a piggish sort of man, but elected for being amiable and generous. His evacuation from his city was delayed, bowing to the political impetus to morale. His city was a transport hub, never meant as a shelter, and being so far from the action it might be safe. Now it was too late. He was a man ill-suited for the task of leading a war-torn populace, but he was the best they had. The other major command shelters were either out of contact or likely dead. To his credit, he suffered through it with grit and determination, and more than a little nervous sweat. He reeked of panic. This isn't our fight," he continued. "What did we do to really deserve this?" he added with a wave all around the broken city. Theirs was an entirely different situation from Tokyo 3, and it was utterly unfair to expect them to act the same way. "Germany is dead. The land is bare, the rivers are dry, dead. We don't have anything left. We've had enough of this. I realize I may not have full authority here, but for decency's sake, man, end this!" "We're all in this together, sir, and again I must ask for your patience. The reason why we're still here is because the Cradle does not have as much of a massive unstoppable force as it likes to pretend it does. It's like the Mongols and their mobility, being able to go from one region to another with such speed that it seems like there's a much greater attacking force than their numbers would imply. The Cradle still hasn't broken through our defences. If we could just hold on, help is sure to come." "And how many more will die until that happens? Nerve and Dieva. This is all they're doing. Bringing it back here will just make things worse." Murmurs of assent rose from the gathered mob. "If we can just stop provoking them, we can leave." "You can't trust the Cradle. What we have is the best defence mortal effort can bring. And please, remember it's the Cradle that is the invader here." But almost as fast as those words were out of his mouth, Feckeldraft realised it was a mistake. "You are here ahead of the Cradle," spoke up the uniformed man to his left. The local garrison commander was Colonel Shaft. His face was hidden almost entirely in bloodied bandages. There was still a lot about Gotha that retained a certain town-like charm, mostly in the lack of really tall buildings and many tasteful open spaces. All this made it hideously difficult to defend. "We have less than 500 men and 20 armoured vehicles. As much as I hate to admit it, this is futile, and it's you people that the Cradle seek from this place. Perhaps it's time to let them have what they want." A few of the leopard 3Cs rumbled into view. Feckeldraft sighed. And how much more dangerous would the Cradle become if they had access to the secrets and abilities they possessed? What would work against an angel could work against an Evangelion. "And if we don't comply, Colonel, what then?" "I don't like it, but I'll do whatever's necessary to ensure the safety of these people." "We stand against the Cradle. The threat of tanks is not enough. Your mind is not unknown to me. We can stop you." "Yes, you can. And then what?" 5 million people couldn't fit into the street in front of St. Margaret's Church, and there were at most only 600 people there, mostly soldiers and former society notables. Their feelings were echoed by the populace. "We might be the last remaining sample of our nation and our culture," Colonel Shaft said sadly. "Even if the Cradle's to blame, we've no other choice but to throw ourselves to their mercy and try to flee. It's shameful, but I've seen what it's like to be caught where Evangelions battle. We can only endure. There's no victory for us little beings there." "You not speak to me of enduring shame, Colonel," the monk replied with cool hostility. "I was born Michael Avram Feckeldraft, son of Simon, son of Ezra, and I have outlived and abandoned too many of my friends to cower now." He showed his right wrist, and the blue numbers tattooed there. "No, Colonel, the cradle does not show mercy. You will have to buy your safety. You will have to pay with treachery." Images and emotions leaped through. He was a young man then, raw and untrained. The best his terror-numbed mind could do was get himself continually forgotten or pushed to the back of the line. The other survivors likely thought he was some officer's favourite to a spy in their midst. Their hatred was a physical thing, even if no one had enough energy to act upon it. To be powerless and alone, it was the same situation, wasn't it? They both had their own faith in Soyu's return. The issue was if there would be anyone left to rescue when the time comes. There was no malice there, but the fact remained, most of the Psychana weren't even European. It wasn't a question of race, but fighting and dying for the sake of those few who weren't even their own countrymen. The officer sighed. "How much longer must we carry the sins of our fathers? That's not a compelling argument either. 5 lives for 5 million. It should be so simple. If taking you would give the cradle stronger weapons, then you should have the courage to end it yourself." "A bastard sort of valour," the monk grimaced. It was a cruel impasse and one of Nagisa's favourite dilemmas. He forced inevitability and waited to see which side would break first. How easy mankind kills, how so breakable their alliances of words and dependencies. In the end, even the most selfless heroism was a self-centered stubbornness. If they did nothing, eventually the insatiable forces of the enemy would overwhelm their divided defences. If the people surrendered, the powerful psychominds the cradle so needed would either be theirs or be removed from the battle plan. If the psychos prevailed, by either killing or subverting the defenders, the sweet hypocrisy was enough. The cradle's AT field surged and the purplish miasma thickened to almost black. It had its own troubles. It was afraid, and with that fear it struck. The psychic shield buckled for a moment. With an exultant roar, one of the dragons got through. One of the armoured Psychana standing next to their Lama changed his grip on his force sphere. He hefted it back and then threw it like a javelin. The dragon gave a deafening screech and fell. It bounced off the tiled roofs of a local college and slid to the streets, cracking the pavement. It was quite dead. It was also much larger up close than they had dared assumed. The old monk bit his lip. The gall of Nagisa and his forces at the cradle. They could make the whole earth fantastic like that. They would hand over control over mankind's destiny to less random factors. Just like with exercise, a little pain, a little suffering was necessary for improvement. The sheer arrogance! Nagisa decided these things like a living god, moulding the earth where he walked. The people were afraid. The soldiers resigned to their fates. The miasma had lifted, but it still left dark shadows upon the Thuringen woods, and bestial howls now and then erupted from the gloom. There was one more such howl, but it was cut short in mid-yell. A chimera came roaring down the highway, with what looked like an overly large wolf clinging to its front. The personnel carrier rammed itself into a gas station. There was sadly no explosion. It ploughed through, bereft of its strange passenger. The rear hatch opened and someone tossed out a grenade. There was a large explosion and pained howl. As noted, there are several disadvantages to the Chimera chassis. It was, however, quite convenient it looked so much like a tractor. There were slots to fit a dozer blade. The most obvious advantage was the thing's sheer toughness coupled with decent speed. Both proved necessary for its survival. Its small turret with the dual bolters was a slagged ruin. A deep gash run lengthwise through its left side, gouging through the entire line of hull-mounted gun ports. The right side wasn't much better, pockmarked with blast damage. There were missing bits of track, but the tank managed to keep going. The Chimera rebounded as it hit a concrete protrusion at full speed, and for a while there everyone thought it would tip over. The tank slammed back to the ground, busting a track as it did so. Sparks and metallic screeches followed in its path as it ground away the last few hundred feet. People leapt out of the way. Then, almost mercifully, it stopped. The rear hatch fell out of its hinges. Through dust and smoke, a few figures stepped out from the vehicle. They all had gas masks on, and their posture showed only deep weariness. The last 3 dragged a struggling brown figure from the Chimera, a man in a form-fitting black suit with long white hair, but a young and astonishingly beautiful face. Though gagged, he began screaming as soon as the sunlight touched his body. He was thrown to the ground. He thrashed around wildly. He screamed some more and he burned. The flesh evaporated right out of his skeleton, leaving a blackened collection of bones, which then crumbled into dust. Thus was the price of immortality. The cradle put in controls, put in castes. Once you joined, it was almost impossible to disobey. The scent made things interesting, but the purpose would always be fulfilled. Nagisa couldn't join the hive mind, but it bore the patterns of his thoughts. Flesh was nothing. Pain was nothing. The damned would live again. The lead figure took off his gas mask and saluted. "We can unitate reporting back, sir," the young man said to the man with the highest rank pips. "The roads to Jenna and beyond are still unsafe." A little bit less unsafe now, but still. "What happened to Mr. Hearn?" Lama Feckeldraft indelicately put in. There was something odd about this young man. It wasn't the blank stare of shell shock, but a remote serenity he was familiar with, that of a meditative state. "He has been injured, sir, but he is stable. My apologies, but I'll be speaking for the other troops in lieu of a translator." The others from the Chimera stood around, for if they let themselves sit down, they might decide it'd be too much of a bother to get up again. German, French, even the downed English pilot, it didn't matter. All were too tired from their insane debacle. "How did you get back without someone to mask your presence?" "We followed the orders, sir, and just killed anything standing in the way." The young man's expression never changed from a sort of bland disinterest. Only his alert eyes showed he was not a lobotomized tool. "I see. What's your name, young one?" For a moment there, a flicker of emotion passed across the soldier's face. It wasn't anger taken from insult, but from regret. The panzer driver answered, unspoken but clear enough. "I may follow your orders, but I serve someone else now." The name meant nothing to either Feckeldraft or Shaft, but the utter annihilation of the combined French, German and West Soviet divisions meant the Cradle now had those men and war machines. Death, as proved elsewhere, was at best a temporary condition. "What else can you report?" asked Shaft. Like the psyche, found the young man somewhat discomforting. "Other shoulders. Survivors." The miasma messed up the entire breadth of the electromagnetic spectrum. Only the psychic beacons, which operated outside of rational space, could function. Wilfred looked pained, but he couldn't find the words. How could he speak of how they'd found shelters blasted open, bleached skulls in the trees, dry riverbeds, tanks that moved without drivers and myths given flesh? They'd found people huddled around dim fires. He'd called out to them, but they'd refused to leave their meagre circle. There were soldiers who fired upon them, trusting no one, and the dead of the civilians who had begged for their help piled high upon their improvised barricades. The hunters that sought their tank as prey occasionally went ahead to show the grisly trophies. What could he say? Then, as now, he'd felt nothing. No other survivors. He reached into his pocket and brought out a glowing round stone, a psychic beacon. The beast has taken everything of value from this land. Deserts and mountains and forests formed an effective time-wasting barrier, but ever has it been easier, and cheaper, to transport by sea. From Vladivostok, 3 different armies from 3 nations rushed to provide support. Timing was crucial. Castle Sturmbrand would provide the distraction, but they too must support the attack. Yang had, as an intellectual exercise, pondered how to strike at Europe. The best conventional strategy would be to push up through Mongolia and Kazakhstan and remove the immediate threat of Russia. Obvious and therefore the most difficult, even barring that they needed each other to keep from total economic collapse. The UN strategic forces were volunteer regiments from many different nations, and ever has speed been a priority. The world was a sphere. The Chinese Navy was the strongest in the world as long as he led it. On a purely theoretical basis, it would be much faster to circle around past the Bering Sea, through the Arctic and down into the Baltic Sea. There were the usual dangers of ice, enemy fleets and submarines, but the situation at the Cradle, they were no longer any problem. Out from the gloom emerged more tanks at full speed, firing at something behind them. Chimeras, most of them bearing a red star upon green hulls. There were a few Lehman Russ, packing hull-mounted las cannons. There were a portion of the gathered troops at Vladivostok, set to invade Tokyo 3 at a moment's notice. The Cradle tried but couldn't stop their deployment. They had all made appearances of heading off to reinforce Yang and young Ikari. They landed last night. A powerful mind could shield the many, and 1,000 minds could shield a nation. Stealth was impossible when AT fields were concerned, except if you used the naturally opposing force. The sustenance the Cradle needed, but now better to throw them into the fray and risk it all. Dragons swooped down and died in droves. They had tough scales and could breathe fire. The lack of double-A defences was one of the reasons the protectors of Gotha felt such despair. No longer. Some of the larger worms spat globes of fire, which were deflected by a whip of flame coming from the lead vehicle. Out of an open turret of a very large tank with sponsons mounting 6 bolters to each side, an old wrinkled man grinned into the wind. AT fields were certainties. PSI were probabilities. The world was still full of wonder. It didn't need such artificial encouragement. The old abbot felt like a child again. The perfection of the outward path was ever meant to be used. Warming an entire valley deep in the Himalayas for millennia. That was just practice. The psychic barrier stiffened, shrinking but stronger now.
And by the way, greetings from Yang Wen Li.
Even the great strategist serves. Castle Sturmbrand shook, and the harsh noise of breached armour echoed through its corridors. Captain Shade coughed, trying to wave away acrid black smoke and the smell of burnt plastic.
Damage report.
Hull bridge from deck 4, level C to deck 3, level H. The fires on deck 6, level L have been contained. We lost the capacitor clusters 44R to 45R. No damage to weapons, systems or propulsions.
Casualties?
Burns, some minor injuries. No fatalities. He leaned back on his seat and sighed in relief. The Teplin had 6 vertical decks numbered from top to bottom, with the 6th as the main cargo hold. It was also laid out horizontally into 15 sections labelled from A to O from fore to aft. At full speed, the decks became walls, and the sections turned to floors, due to the inertial forces of supersonic flight. While technically it would be possible to endure it lying down, from the start designing so that the personnel should be able to walk around helped in terms of damage control. The insides of Castle Sturmbrand felt like a cathedral. This was from the vaulted appearance of cross bracings between decks and sections. Dr. Yamu Thompson had already put aside the insanity of something that shouldn't even be able to float, much less fly.
Interesting. This is interesting.
Asuka chuckled. Her breathing was strained, her eyes were starting to look bloodshot. As noted, Sturmbrand couldn't generate a barrier-type AT field, lest it run into its own defensive wall. Softening the field could get incoming attacks to perhaps detonate at a safe distance. The anti-kinetic battle screens were working perfectly. Radiation and lasers were but different frequencies of energy in the electromagnetic spectrum. Fortunately, Castle Sturmbrand's hull was well named. Incredibly thick and tough, ablating against those that could get through the more esoteric defences. Not impregnable, but damn near close. Their braking front was 4 kilometres wide. The shock from their passing was visible from space. The sonic booms rebounded off the ocean surface, causing an atmospheric effect similar to that of a nuclear shockwave. A typhoon in their path was pierced right through, and actually broke apart from the reactive forces sufficient to overcome its Coriolis form.
Second wave incoming!
Mayumi Yamagishi shouted. The Cradle's high-speed projectiles were invisible to conventional radar. Even LiDAR was of limited effect, as the things operated similar to the principle of a homing laser, only as applied to appreciable mass instead of energy. There were blue pattern detectors on the great craft, but these weren't linked to auto-targeting systems. They detected the presence of fields, not discrete objects. Nerve sensors back at Tokyo 3 could make do, but not the rudimentary systems hurriedly loaded on board. Gunnery controllers waited tensely for the objects to hit the edge of Unit 3's AT field. 4 kilometres off, the blurry objects became large white discs. They had to slow down due to the interference between fields and the utter uselessness of nukes set to contact detonation. These were not nukes, however. The discs numbered 17 in all, and they continued on at a much slower velocity, but also weaving about in unpredictable patterns.
Weapons free!
Was the command.
Blast those things out of the sky!
Within the confines of Mayumi's AT field, local radar can now reliably detect the approaching enemy. Threads of fire burst out from Sturmbrand's hull. The hull ports that looked like cathedral windows revealed a AA Hydra variant for the versatile Chimera platform. There hadn't been time to actually bolt in turrets and such, thus the broadside arrangements. Hydras were 4 fire-linked 90mm guns in 8 Hydra platforms to each side. Of the 9 hydras to each side, 2 of these were king hydras, mounting quad laser cannons instead. Multiple phalanx CIW guns supported the defence. By that time, the discs had already surrounded the Teplin. All but 4 of the inbound projectiles were shot down. The surviving objects paused right before hitting the hull. The closer the disc got, the slower they must move. Only that way could they actually pass through the anti-kinetic battle screen. It was actually a small miracle any such things managed to get through at all. Impossibly, they remained motionless relative to the castle, despite lacking any sort of obvious propulsion system. They realigned themselves parallel to the hull and split open. Arms and legs emerged, while the centrepiece pushed up to become an X-shaped head. The right arm sprouted a particularly unsubtle cannon, and the beams began to eat away at the ablative outer hull.
Prepare for body action!
What would the proper name for a biomechanical angel-human hybrid be? Nephilim didn't seem appropriate, since these were meant as weapons instead of distinct entities. The staff from Nerve Boston hit upon the name Ashimar, incidentally the same name by those who met them at Europe, and for much the same reason. The machine cult introduced its members to certain obscure interests. The fact that cherry-red Castle Sturmbrand was at least 3 times faster than anything that had flown before was but coincidence. Asuka had promised to stab the first person to call the damn things mobile suits. They weren't piloted after all. She then groaned about actually knowing such trivia. Kensuke was due for a punch in the face. He'd corrupted her. There was little pressure differential between inside the hull and the sky outside. The AT field took care of that. The Ashimar were biomechanical giants, humanoid in shape, 12 metres tall. Apparent gravity took over as they entered the castle's war hull, and they slammed into the section floors. Attacking from distant points dispersed the defenders. They were effectively immune to everything up to light cannon and even heavy bolters. Castle Sturmbrand was an ad hoc construct and had little in the way of inside defences. The Ashimar were terrible things, being able to savage land and air with equal ease. The Teplin counted as death trap. Man-portable las cannon, stripped out of Tempest gunships, removed the armour advantage while confined spaces meant there was no hope of dodging fire. Sophisticated bioweapons, capable to outperforming any human-made land, air or sea combat vehicle, were reduced to self-destructing as living bombs just to do some damage. Absolute territory is a matter of perception, not a measurable gradient, Dr. Donald Thompson muttered to himself as he watched a group of Psychana swarm and cut to pieces of being at least 6 times their size. Soryu has absolute command within this castle. I understand now. It's her region of quantum certainty. It's the reason we're not eating antimatter right now. Indeed, earlier one of the nukes had actually detonated inside the hull. The craft was too huge for Terminators to protect section by section, but one of the Heraclitus' helmet cameras caught the event. One of the Ashimar shoved a 10-megaton device through a hole and then flew back. The nuke detonated well enough, but the air itself thickened around the blast. The Heraclitus Terminator, one Constantine Valder, crossed his arms over his head, though knowing how futile it would be. There was a boom, a shockwave enough to knock him back, and he could feel heat even through his armour. But the fact that he could feel it was incredible. He was 7 metres away from a hot nuke. Perhaps he was already dead. He opened his eyes. The sight was incredible. Brilliant white clouds swirled around the tunnel, and there was this white curtain inching forward, making a crackling noise where it touched the walls. The curtain of energy kept on expanding for a few more moments, then abruptly reversed. Castle Sturmbrand buckled as the nuclear explosion burst outwards in a conical blast. Air rushed out of the gaping wound in the Teplin's side until filament threads of wraithbone linked together to seal up the hole. Valder blinked. The walls ahead still glowed red-hot, though the superconductive properties of wraithbone was already working to dump the heat elsewhere. His arm was scorched and blackened, the gold filigrees melted into unrecognisable lumps. But he'd become the first ever human being to survive a point-blank nuclear detonation. After a while, he shrugged and looked for a replacement man-portable laser cannon. It was not the weirdest thing he'd seen in young Ikari's service. Thompson felt like curling up in a corner somewhere. Insane. He could finally understand why the AT field was also called the Absolute Terror Field. Peace was dead. Even if the Angels were defeated, armies would still clash, millions would die, and cities would burn. People would do anything to possess control over the Evangelion. What about when Evangelions must fight other Evangelions? An even worse thought. If that was possible within this region of absolute terror, What would happen to them when they reached the Cradle's own true domain? He looked outside. Everyone else was eager to find out. The Tempest gunship pilots most of all, for the Teplin's speed meant to deploy them too soon would be to leave them useless and left behind in the middle of the Atlantic. That the whale of an airship managed to swallow a nuke and live was only a slap to the face, shameful proof of their continual inability to provide air cover. These people. He didn't understand them. Even the ones that had boarded with him back at Nerve Boston. Had they changed so much in just a few hours? Did he ever have some sort of mental influence, even as much as they so despised that from the Cradle? Or was it simply that the tempering effect of civilization on the human psyche could be stripped so easily? Had man ever really learned? The Cradle, however, didn't really care much about the bitter resistance nearby. More important was stopping Soryu. There was no stopping Soryu. "We missed! How could we miss?" Martin Bettelheim shouted. "It's a goddamn lizard! It travels at light speed!"
Soryu does not have to avoid the beam. She only has to avoid our aim,
Sarah Campbell replied flatly.
The primary weapon of this cradle is meant for blasting through fortifications. The moon cannot dodge.
Aren't they supposed to be homing anywhere? This is not some form of epic-scale magic missile, Karu pointed out with some amusement. If you keep on thinking that, it won't be long before we find ourselves bathing in this spell magic.
We have exhausted almost all of our aerial drones.
Dr. Lader's mechanical voice sounded strange.
Even with our assets, there's a limit to how quickly we may repurpose fissionables. It can't be just the power of the S2 engine. We have 3 equivalent power sources.
We need more attuned minds. For all his power, Karu still couldn't connect with the Cradle mind, so had to ask, what's happening with that place in Turingia?
The fools still resist. We have surrounded them as unto a ring of fire, but it will take us some time. We must sometimes destroy some healthy cells to get at the cancer. If the power of heaven is not enough, I shall become as a doctor of hell to bring the healing of the greater good.
Mayor Stark Matstein cried tears of fear and shame. He had squealed like a pig as he was thrown to the ground, just like how he was taunted and bullied way back at school so long ago. They'd keep on hitting him until he oinked. He'd worked hard, he'd grown powerful, but the fear and feeling of helplessness was keen as ever.
There will be no surrender!
Wilfred had his knee pressed to the mayor's gut and his bolt pistol pressed to his forehead. Those who arrived with him had gathered in a circle around the scene, with their battered guns and knives aimed outwards. The rest of the soldiers were likewise at the ready. The civilians could only look on in anxious horror.
To give up now is to give up forever. You'll die today as a man, or be slaughtered as cattle.
Wilfred looked up. They were angry and afraid and beyond shame. It was one thing to give up one's life for a cause, but that for man's own family? Wives, sons and daughters, for them even the mayor could be brave. There was a certain fatalism in his eyes that the soldier could understand, but fear for his family was stronger than even that. Everyone else's eyes, it was the same question. Can you keep them safe? Can you ensure our children will fill the space left by their parents? The situation had abruptly reversed, but Colonel Shaft remained unmoved.
Even with this, there are still not enough men nor weapons to create a convincing defence. Do you think you'll be a martyr this way? You think we haven't sacrificed enough? There's no point in shedding even more blood. We can't stop the Cradle. Right now, only the safety of 5 million people should be our priority.
There's no safety in running, only protection won by the lives of other more worthy souls. You can only earn freedom by blood and honest toil, Lama Feckeldraft said, as if many guns weren't pointed their way. Though the reinforcements had brought tanks, Chimeras weren't armoured enough to withstand the Leopard 3C's 150mm APF SDS rounds. The Land Raider, and the strongest psyche on the planet, that was another matter entirely. You are not innocents here. You can only buy the enemy's favour with murder. You know this. This young soldier knows this. The colonel clenched his fists. He'd served the army well. He was no coward. He was no moron either, to waste his own life on futile gestures.
So you would rather have millions suffer in the middle of a war zone than relinquish control? Do you know how all this sounds?
He pointed at Wilfred.
This is insane. Do you know who you sound like?
The young man snarled and would have pulled the trigger right there. How dare he?
You think I give a fuck?
The ground trembled before he could take a step. The crake was strong enough to toss him off his feet. Hills gave way, and the miasma itself began to spin around a point far off in the distance. A glaring eye began to form. Towering spikes of black, chitin-like material rose from the broken ground. They split open like flowers, and curved pylons slowly slid out. The homing laser used 2 overlapping layers of AT fields, one to contain the beam, another to direct it. Sparks of greenish energy danced between the 2 ends of the metal arc. At the centre of the pylon was a crystal lens, a massive psychoreactive crystal. Superconductors and super-efficient capacitors were what the world needed for the next massive paradigm shift. Unfortunately, these were materials that defied current definitions. They brought quantum processes into macro-spatial levels, and couldn't be produced without someone there to actually observe and direct their creation. They might have been called solidified AT fields, were it not that the objects were also utterly unaffected by such energies, and that the AT fields were pretty much fucking magic already. Wraithbone could grow. This wasn't so unusual, as crystals and other non-organic structures also grew, such as stalagmites. The problem was that Wraithbone could, if directed, strip necessary elements out from the air. Atom by atom, in a complex compound pattern, they appear. For all they knew, it might be converting hydrogen into other elements at will. Psychoreactive crystals, if one could simply get past the whole psychic energy thing, were far less confusing. Crystals for given size and purity could contain energy up to a point until they break. The energy is then released in bright but harmless light. The problem was that where exactly does the energy go? Other than the leak of cool light, there was no indication of how it actually contains the power. Psychic energy was actually known as such simply by the ability to charge the crystals, which may then be tapped in the form of fuel for psychic abilities or simple electricity. A sufficiently large and pure crystal capacitor might as well be called a 0-point module. Every human being on Earth was psychic, even if to some infinitesimal degree. This was proven by the collective unconsciousness that allowed certain people to speak in tongues. More than Evangelions or power, the Cradle needed minds to examine. If there was no psychogene, then they would discover it, or create it. More useful to the current situation, it could allow them to pierce an AT field without having to resort to mass firepower or closing in to neutralize it. And even better, to craft the utter opposite, the pariah gene, to be immune to defects in reality. A sliver of greenish energy flicked out, crossing the sky and fading off into the distance. The day was green, the light reflected off the miasma covering. Flash, 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 out towards the distance. The psychic shield fell. Even if the energies were mutually opposing, the Cradle bled off too much power. It was a side effect. Miasma poured into Gotha. The Land Raider was a natural progression from the wraparound tracks of the Chimera and the Lehman Russ. Many engineers had already convinced themselves. Though nearly 200 tons, it avoided many of the pitfalls of the ambitiously impractical Mouse. For one thing, it was much larger, and thus the footprint of its tracks spread its weight over a greater area. It was also faster. It used the chassis not to carry a massive gun, but to carry elite troops. Furthermore, its guns were extremely efficient microwave lasers instead of bulky solid slug cannons. Recovered Evangelion plate made them practically invulnerable to most conventional weapons. If you could build one, why not two? If the critical shortfall was supply of Evangelion plate, why not try conventional steel armour? If you could build two, you already have the manufacturing lines to build more. Why stop there? Evangelion armour was made with human technology, so it was possible to build more. It was just slow and time-consuming. The factories at Lem in Belarus had only limited access to Evangelion plate for the first run of Lehman Russ. The Chinese had even less, having lost almost everything from their own nerve site, but Yang had managed to get a hold of some armour material straight from the in his manufactoria. Sure, the Soviets could boast some of the hardest new tanks, and Japan/America, alongside their Ava construction capabilities, some of the most sophisticated weapons. China could boast the single, toughest, meanest tank on the planet. As it didn't have to carry 10 Terminators, until later, most of its carrying capacity was devoted to extra ammunition. The Rudan pattern Land Raider Crusader tore through an advancing line of brutes. It was a slab of dark green metal, blocking 2 whole avenues by itself. The situation around Gotha was fuss. Most of the city was considered lost. The old castle up on a small hill was crammed with people. Buildings were to the north, and to the south was an open expanse of parkland and railways. The enemy attacking from the north could be handled almost alone by the Land Raider. They were forced in to narrow their files, and their railguns failed to affect the anti-kinetic battle screen. Unlike the one used by Castle Sturmbrand, the screen was made by force of will alone. 900 generations and the mightiest minds of each age, continually reincarnating into a single human shell. The psychoreactive crystal contained energy. Unlike the AT field, which seemed to spontaneously alter space-time, psychic prowess rested upon the conversion of existing energy states.
"'S all there is, proven by science even,"
the chief abbot of the ancient order of Javal put aside his cigar.
"Every death here fuels the enemy too."
Whips of fire and spikes of earth bloomed around him. He paced around the top of the Land Raider. Like a printer's head going back and forth across a page, he defined a boundary no one could cross. East and west, away from the main road, the enemy could try an assault with some concentration of troops. They were called the Undying. They were faster, stronger, and more resilient than mortal men. They were servants of the gods as detailed in the true Book of the Dead. They were the cursed of Ra. They were physical perfection personified. They longed for blood. The fresher, the better. Religion drew the focused mind, and they existed to add that power into their own unholy lineage. They, too, were the last and more powerful of their traditions. The Cradle added the last final touch that turned them into vampire, like the mythos. Perhaps Nagisa was being playful. They could no longer disobey any of his whims. The vampire were jumping from wall to wall on the buildings. Soon enough they'd break the defensive line to get at the civilians. In less than an hour, every one of those people would be mindless slaves to thrown into the cauldron of battle. The Psychana had to fall back to engage other high-mobility combatants. Screaming, a group of soldiers emerged from hiding to shoot at them from behind. The enemy had supernatural speed and reflexes, true, but they didn't dodge bullets as much as they gauged the intent they could see. As expected, the enemy took the bait. They sprung at the soldiers, bearing fangs and sharpened nails. Wilfred's bolt pistol killed the one leaping at him. The 2 soldiers on either side were not so lucky. As they fell, the former tank driver whirled about to blow one pale head off its shoulders, and completing a full swing, stabbed a knife into the eye of another misbegotten enemy mutant psyker. They were dead things, but so what? He was dead too. Only the purpose filled him. She'll come to claim her people. But the hope and fury of man must wake up, and by the blood of the enemy the sacrifice will be made. Then the monks arrived, leaping from building face to another in the same way as their enemy, as if they were made of air. Instead of crawling across the vertical walls, they ran as gravity was always down to their perceptions. Those Psychana were not so physically potent, carried guns and trusted in blessed luck.
"Cut and thrust!"
yelled white-robed figures, their swords sparkling in the sun.
"Stab and cut! Let the ancient promise be fulfilled!"
They were the last and final legacy of Javal, and the ancient monastery in the Himalayas was empty of every fighting man or woman. It was as they had feared. To reveal themselves to the world was to destroy themselves. They didn't wear power armour, for even when operating at a practically unlimited budget, there was a limit to how quickly these could be constructed. The fighters preferred not to be burdened with armour anyway. Speed was life. To stop moving was to die. Ironically, this was something Nagisa also believed, in regards to evolution, and in giving humanity fantastic predators to weed out the weak. It was like something out of an old martial arts movie, the ones where monks seemed to take such glee in being cut down that, collapsing, they sorted themselves out in convenient piles. How ridiculous it looked did not hide the sheer skill it would take to actually perform the same feat against unwilling enemies armed with ranged weapons. Brutes fell by the dozens, and like the combat monks facing them might as well have been wearing air, such was the penalty of heavy armour. Battle precognition made up for the rest. It was a slight coincidence their robes and such looked like those of Old Republic Jedi. Some of them carried double-edged spear staffs. Curly Krishna the Sunshine Kid coughed. His lungs were blackened ruins. He had lived for so long sustained by the power of his mind and his will, waiting for the prophecy to be fulfilled. He laughed again, and it was a sad, weedy sound. Hero Destroyer, a brute torso mounted on a skimmer frame, was yanked out to the sky by invisible forces and thrown into an orderly formation of enemy heavy infantry. There, screaming people ran into buildings and whatever shelter they could find. Some of those buildings collapsed in the frenetic fighting and killed all those within. There a man tried to surrender, only to be cut down from both sides. "You will not fear the enemy's spilling of blood. The enemy can take our blood, but they want our souls. Only we can give them our souls," Wilfred yelled. "The enemy will take no more." Those who choose to join the Cradle did so with the implicit acceptance of humanity being weak and obsolete. And from the deeps there arose a mighty beast, of many eyes and many limbs, and the beast from the darkness did set upon the light of mankind with hateful thirst and unnatural hunger. Codex Imperialis, page 45, the Third City and Chaos Within. Just words, random meanderings of some writer somewhere, meant to fluff up a setting. The angels and humanity, at least they had their own power. Those who would live between, however, must steal the light from either. Wilfred breathed roughly and ran to join another firefight. As a tanker, he dimly thought about how the Lehman Russ Vanquisher was the ugliest bastard of an armoured combat vehicle he'd ever seen. The extra long cannon was nice, even if it was on top of a prominent turret. It was slightly off-centre, and beside it were a pair of twin-linked bolters. That was in addition to the sponson-mounted heavy bolters. The las cannon up front had better combat endurance, but a horrible firing rate. As expected, that tank had quickly run out of ammo and had to pull back. He and his men had to fill up the gap. The Cradle had let loose its angel spawn. They were like dogs with monkey faces and had talons that could tear into tank armour. Fortunately, they also lacked armour of their own. Gotha, one of the rear shelters, had just around 8 hours to prepare. Their barricades were puny. Wilfred understood now why the Cradle sought psychers with such obsession. The wrinkled old man could bend earth with a gesture, and within minutes had given them some hard fallback points. Behind one of those stone walls, he and a small group of troopers held off a tide of gnashing hairless warhounds. NATO 5.56 rifle rounds sufficed. Bolt rounds were overkill, and perhaps that was the intent, to drain the defenders' ammo. The Cradle clearly didn't care about throwing away these creatures en masse. "All life has value," said the Cradle. "Human life most of all." This implied, however, that there was a scale by which they measured the worth of existence. Some life had value overall, and some nearly none at all. "Pull back! Leave it to the flamers! Support the southern defences!" was the order. Chimeras rolled down to set the place ablaze. The crude animal minds of the Warhound still feared fire. Running again, though he was a panzer trooper, Wilfred had in a few hours picked up the knack for commanding infantry squads. They didn't really need more than to point their guns in one direction and try to fire at the same time. Loud roars came from within the miasma. The protective clearing had shrunk to just around Schloss Friedenstein. The enemy's main attack came from the south, past the railways, the only place where their mass infantry could gather. Fortunately, it was also the perfect spot for artillery. White smoke obscured the nearby battlefield, while the miasma choked the sky in the distance. Something huge stomped out, and the defiance in its roar carried past the open grounds, the small lake, through the sculpted woods and set the old stone walls to shaking. It shrugged off artillery and battle cannon fire and spat out its reply, a blue hot beam carved into the trenches. Its glittering red bionic eye flashed, its two little arms ending in sickle claws were waved about in anger. Another roar issued from a mighty jaw ahead, and the Mechasaurus strode forward. Similar forms joined it soon after, those with hard turtle-like shells that mounted large cannon, fins on their backs that seemed to protect a defensive field, tails that threw explosive barbs, jaws that bite, and dragons from the sky.
"Isn't this interesting?" the Cradle mind delivered to their minds. "Inefficient, sure, but the variety. Life. It is the struggle that defines us. We will remake the world, not to our image, but into something that will never lack in wonder, in glory, in value, and in high adventure. See the power that can change it all. We defy destiny."
A tyrant king bit into a Marder APC, lifted it high and tossed it away, as if to say, "Your shapes bore me." Its roar was a challenge. Its animal mind yearned for that which can equal its might. Wilfred looked stunned. Still, he felt no panic. He wanted to curl up and hide, but still nothing. The samurai spoke of Zen in battle, and there was the berserker ganger. Monks in rote prayer and mindless tanks try to achieve that state of utter emptiness, when ego is gone, and the soul is empty of all hopes and all desires, and God fills the vessel ready. The cradle offered enlightenment at a glance, nirvana in an instant. He wondered briefly if it was theirs to grant at all. Could anyone call upon it, or does the state of holiness arrive on its own? He looked beside him, to the mixture of weary and frightened faces. It didn't matter. He didn't wish others to share his bleak but painless existence. No, there is no choice left but therefore war, and I choose war. Until Soyo comes, we will hold against these scum. He pointed at the enemy with his sword, one of the historical relics once again made useful. For Germany, for Soyo, and for war. Men, affix bayonets and charge! For war! Shouted those with him. Not a few were civilians who had chosen to pick up a fallen gun. Some of them toted cannons torn off brute arms. Those who couldn't affix bayonets found something sharp to stab with. The dead have no need of anything else! Krieg! 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 They shouted as they broke cover. 3 Mechasauri roared, already having crossed most of the barriers. Behind them, the old fortress was nearly defenceless. Krieg! Endlos Krieg! Feckeldraft had no time to enjoy fighting alongside his old mentor. He ran to join the defenders to the south, but knew he couldn't make it in time. The cradle could teleport hither and thither with impunity, but mere mortal minds couldn't handle such a heavy strain. It was a futile gesture, men like straw blown by the wind upon a stone. The tanks were not doing much damage to Mechasaurian hides. What could pointed metal carried by human hands do against such resilience? The Tyrant King snapped at Wilfred, only spurring him to run even faster. He dived, and he could feel a massive head passing just scant inches above. He rolled aside to avoid stomping feet. Still, he felt nothing. No fear, no exhilaration. His heart was pounding, but only with bland exertion. There is still power in humanity, he spat at the beast. Wake him up with your devotion. Shine forth his glory with your faith. In his name, cleanse, purge, kill. The Tyrant King was irritated. Its puny arms couldn't reach the human gnat scrambling up its back. Absently, it considered going to the ground, but decided it wasn't worth the trouble. There were other puny creatures to kill. Though a cybernetic creature, the Mechasaurus was still a living being. It needed to breathe. Wilfred found a nostril and jammed a grenade into it. The damage was only slight, but the pain brought the Tyrant King to the ground. Wilfred leapt off before he could get crushed by the thing's weight. The thing roared as it slowly tried to get back up. The few seconds of delay was precious, but still not enough. Hold! Hold and fight! He shouted to the others, not really looking nor caring if they followed. Prayer may cleanse the soul, but pain purifies the body. Kill them to the last! Wilfred had long since forgotten to reload his bolt pistol. He pulled the trigger, and with a glorious dagger, bolt rounds punched into the Tyrant King's open maw. The inside of its jaw was only less tough than its armoured hide, so he switched to full auto. How many rounds should an officer's bolt pistol hold? He threw himself into its mouth, pointed down its gullet, and pulled the trigger again. The mouth shut, with teeth and jaws capable of tearing through tank armour locking into place. Muffled noises came from within. The Tyrant King spasmed and roared, and it died. Feckeldraft watched as the other remaining troops diverted the Saurian attackers. In good time, Lehman Russ vanquishers arrived. Their 180mm guns were powerful enough, but each armour-piercing shell were marked by the Aquila and blessed by prayer of the Golden Saint. The massive bolt rounds destroyed the enemy beyond hope of regeneration. Precognition had failed the world, but not the young king's foresight. Nagisa was right, in that if ever young Ikari met the time of revelations, he would fight on the side of those billions who'd be cast aside. But still, what sort of mind would prepare for war on such a scale? Was it all really coincidence that he wanted some cool stuff for his city? Was he but a boy playing with toys? It couldn't be that simple. It was too perfect, too convenient. The only other conclusion would be that the boy wanted it to happen, that this was the very war he wanted to fight. It however meant collusion with the Cradle, and as such impossible. So they were back to someone seeing a narrow path for humanity's survival, that even the mightiest psychics on Earth failed to perceive. He trained the boy, but it was the effect he had on other people that was most impressive. So many people. It was they that paid the price for the journey. He went over to the fallen Tyrant King and tried to pull open its jaws. Though slack, it was still too heavy. Der man, der nicht fürchtet, ist nicht weniger mächtig als der von allen gefürchtet wird. The man who fears nothing is not less powerful than he who's feared by everyone. One more worthy soul who paid the price for the journey. It was the way of things that the good should perish so the rest would survive. The old man leaned against the beast and wept. Hey, anyone out there?
Unbelievable!
Ha! And the bitter thing was, the Cradle probably thought they'd done them all a favour anyway. Not until they made it possible could anyone really brag about having to go one-on-one against a cyborg T-Rex and win. If I crawl deeper into this thing's throat, could you get one of the tanks to blast its teeth open? The old man began laughing. This is not funny, whoever you are. I'm running out here. There. Acid is eating into my boots, and there are still more heretics to kill. It took a bit more time for the monk's mirth to subside.
My apologies. Let me go find a lever or some such.
When I left Germany and my father's faith, I felt that I can no longer believe in God. Prophecy, yes, but a benevolent deity, no. I have seen more, and the only godlike being that waits beyond the veil of death is the all-devouring primordial chaos, the great mother that eats her young. We give her lives so she will not wake. He looked around. There was no fate as cursed as those of a people chosen by God, and yet through thousands of years, even as greater empires were forgotten, they remained. For their temple was not built of stone and wood and gold and burnt sacrifice, but of their own bodies. It was happening again. Many were the dead ends and the dead, in the path towards the immortality that is living memory. He left in rage, even though he occasionally longed for the security of that faith. Even more terrifying was the physical proof of his adopted creed. Faith in the invisible and untouchable had been the root of many abuses and many glories, and faith in a rational universe is just as dangerous. Even the Cradle understands how small and powerless is each individual human being. Their science, their symptomatic cause and effect, is no less a terrifying faith than anything.
We will have to suffer a bit more, young soldier, before we finally get the kind and ever-watchful shepherd we so deserve. But better we don't need one through the long night.
He looked up at the sky.
Adonai, if you listen, I beg you spare him and us this bitter cup.
A star in the distance glittered in dark promise. Battered, bloody and on fire, miasma broke apart as it approached. The sunlight showed a scarred, dead land. Her single remaining pocket of resistance was a jewel in both its uniqueness and fragility.
From mankind to stand on its own, for my lands and people who cry out in pain, for wrath, for vengeance!
LCL kept Asuka Langley Soyu from showing any tears. Her voice broke.
Dutchland! I have returned!
Pylons began exploding, one after another, their crystals overwhelmed to the opposing energy. The Cradle Mind screamed as the AT field scoured away at their psychic resonance. Holy crap, she is pissed, Karu muttered numbly. Well, this was my intent. It has succeeded far beyond my projections.
We will have to try our hardest to kill her, Nagisa. I trust that will not be a problem.
The hybrid nodded. I'm a voice in the great mind, a servant of the greater good. I'm not your king, nor do I impel you for a queen. Do as you must, my comrades, and good luck. Dr. Vordlader's biomechanical avatar collapsed into a useless lump. His voice rang through all the Cradle.
The time has come! We fight for our right to exist! We test ourselves by destroying the old order! We fight now! Unseal everything! Release the restraints! Let nothing be lost to hesitation! In unity there is strength! In strength there is serenity! In serenity there is victory! We are the techno-apophysisic unity! The Tao is strong and it will prevail!
Nagisa closed his eyes. I will not face Soyu. She is here, which means Tokyo 3 lacks the power of the S2 engine. Seal will make their move soon, so here she must stay. The trap was set and the prey was obliging. One of the 3 angel cores of the Earth's Cradle dimmed and died, and then Karel Nagisa was half a world away. The Tyrant Kings roared and charged. There were creatures that could breathe, true, but behind their jaws were powerful electromagnetic inducers, and their spines were plasma generators. What came out of their mouths were burning gases at extremely high velocity, contained in self-propagating electromagnetic fields. Weak hellbores, but hellbores nonetheless. No defence could last long against them. It would have been much more sensible to mount energy weapons on mechanical chassis, but a point on sheer technological and power disparity had to be proven.
Schlagen Impact!
Broke the air, and Unit 2's great hammer blasted out a crater half deep as the Ava was tall, and wide as it could hop. Tanks a kilometre away rocked on their treads and nearly flipped over. Those cowering within trenches were nearly sucked out by air pressure. The sound of it, like nightmares being torn apart. A lingering heavy note kept the miasma from reforming. Sping! A cartridge jack at the side of a small house ejected from the G-impact stake. Another compressed Promethean cylinder locked into place with a loud sliding click. "Cartridge, Gelatin," the interface whispered to her ear. Even in Tokyo 3, people were still continually unprepared to see just how big Evangelions really were up close. The Red Avas stride towards the defenders' positions cast the trenches in shadow. This was the monster they had built, but the people there never realised just how so terrible a creature they had brought into the world. Unit 2 turned around and planted its feet firmly between the attacking army and the paltry defenders. Taurian heavy infantry, hovering drones and assorted mechasaura, the biomass the Cradle had gathered, they were put to good use. And now, tragicomically, as weak as the defenders had struggled. Asuka Langley saw you punted a nearby Tyrant King into the horizon. Though twice as large as a real Tyrannosaurus Rex, they were perfectly sized for kicking. Behind her, Castle Sturmbrand dipped into a barely-controlled crash landing, with Mayumi rapidly draining the reserve capacitors. She squealed helplessly. Asuka ignored her plight, her viscous anger at the enemy stirring up the very air. Asuka brandished her hammer.
"Hell or heaven, I don't care!"
She shouted at the Cradle.
"You want a piece of me, you bastards?